Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Alhamdulillah. This is now episode 50 of the podcast The Forward. Myself, Brother Mahdi Locke, author of The Big Step. And today's topic is slavery in Islam versus New World slavery. And Alhamdulillah, I am joined again by Al-Hajj Abu Ja'far al-Hanbali. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
So before we get into the topic, we do have a list of talking points to get through, as well as a recommended reading list. The first thing we wanted to address is to lay this out as to why this is relevant. So we want to get to why is this an important topic now?
Okay. So one of the reasons that this has come up is simply because of the rise of Daesh, which in English has been referred to as ISIS. Places that previously had no slavery or a history of slavery and now have slavery that's been brought in, where you've got slave markets and people are being sold. The same thing has been said to have happened in Northern Africa, Northwest Africa in particular. There have also been a spate of cases where children have been sold off. There have been slavery markets after battles and wars, and a lot of other things like this that have been occurring that have triggered people's response, triggered interest, caused revulsion, caused anger, and then people started asking questions about whether this is part of Islam or from Islam or something that Islam enjoins. And this has also triggered comparisons between what people would view slavery as practiced in the New World, i.e. the United States and South America and Central America, and between Islam. And Europeans have done the same thing, and European nations have done the same thing, almost jumping into the New World camp of slavery versus what Islam says or does regarding slavery.
Yeah, and I'd also add, just from some of the books that I've mentioned before on this podcast, for example, like How We Invented Freedom by Daniel Hannan, which I think is called The Discovery of Freedom, or The Invention of Freedom in the United States. There has been a narrative put out which does hold some truth, but we need to look at it in more depth about how it was the peoples of the Anglosphere who abolished slavery once and for all. And then on top of that, a narrative is put on that there was this thing called the Arab slave trade or Muslim slave trade that lasted far longer and it was far more brutal. And how come no one talks about that? Why does everyone always talk about this New World slavery? So you just have to do some digging online to look at certain videos that people put out there, articles of people out there, books that have come out. And this is why we feel it is important to address this topic. So the first thing we want to get into, this is talking point number one, is defining terms. What are the words that we use? Because again, we have to go back to Arabic because we are Muslims. What are the words that we use to describe slavery? We're going to use the Arabic language. And then what are the words in English?
Okay, so the first order of business is to discuss the word riqqa. The word riqqa in Arabic is generally the word used for slavery or bondage. And it has to do with something is torn when a piece of cloth is raqiq, when it gets torn. Something is marquq, it's been ripped. Right, so this particular thing is to do with when someone has been ripped, pulled, or taken away from their normal attitude of how they are. We don't start with the understanding that men by nature are slaves. Slavery represents a necessary situation in which they've been pulled away from their natural state or taken away from whatever set of circumstances there may be. Outside of the revealed law and before the revelation of the revealed law, there were generally four types of slavery, and more often than not, they were permanent. The first type is sexual slavery. And you had a history of sexual slavery. It wasn't just prostitution, which it was forced upon victims. You had willing prostitution, which you had male prostitutes that served particular temples. You had females that served temples. So one of the great temples in Arabia that was referred to the temple of Al-Lat, Ma'bud Al-Lat, you had what are known as the daughters of Lat. And these daughters of Lat would grow up in these temple compounds, and they would serve the temple. And part of serving the temple would be offering prostitution as a holy or righteous act. And that was permanent. And these, when Islam came, these women fought harder than any of the other people to defend Lat, the temple of Lat, to the very end. Second type of slavery is debt slavery. Someone has been put into slavery, they've been forced into slavery, and the debt, until they clear it, they stay enslaved. But more often than not, interest or other penalties are attached when they don't measure up to the requirements of the creditor. So they stay enslaved. The next type of slavery will be slavery that comes about, which is race-based, which really the revealed law has nothing of the sort in it. But previous societies have had race-based societies or race-based slavery. The fourth and final type, which is known as war slavery, which is more often a temporary slavery when people are prisoners of war, they've been taken along and such, and this type of thing has happened to it. Now, upon the revealed law being handed down, the only slavery that remained in effect was war slavery, because wars came about and they occurred for certain reasons. And even with the slavery from war happening, that slavery was always perceived as temporary. And so when Muslims went to different nations or encountered different peoples, they would always have to start from the clock being at zero. So the Muslims would abolish permanent forms of slavery in Arabia. Then they reach Egypt and they find Roman slavery. And now the clock starts from zero and they have to work through the slow process of abolishing slavery there. Then they reach Armenia and they find the slavery that's there. They have to go through the slow and painful process of abolishing it there. And this was the case everywhere the Muslims had gone. Now, in the process of that occurring, you also would have rulers or corrupt rulers that benefited from previous ruling systems that would use forms of chattel slavery to their benefit. And that we're not denying that, we're not refusing that, we're not attempting to say that that didn't exist. But we're specifically referring to the revealed law. And of interest is the fact that in the books of fiqh or the books of law, there is no reference to a book of slavery. There is a book of manumission, there is a book of freeing slaves, but there is no book of slavery.
Or how to make someone a slave.
Yeah, how to make someone a slave, because the revealed law is very particular in how things are supposed to be done. That how do you make wudu? This is how you make it. This is how you make the prayer. So if slavery was a topic as central to Islam as some people would have us believe, there would be detailed manuals on how to carry that out.
Yeah, exactly. Just for people who aren't aware of it, when we say the revealed law, we are referring what they say in Arabic is the Sharia. So that's clear. So these terms that you've mentioned, like al-Riq, also words that come up like غلمان, sometimes غلام or Jariة. So these are all terms in the Arabic language that indicate or imply temporality.
Yes. Now this, you can trace this back to a hadith that is in Al-Bukhari and Muslim, and is agreed upon by them in authenticity, in which the Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith, as narrated by Abu Hurairah, he said, no one of you should say, my Lord, feed me, Rabb, feed me. And no one of you should say, my Lord, give me water, Rabb. But rather he should say, let Sayyidi, my master, right? Which is, this is a temporary word. Whereas Rabb has to do, because when the Quran was revealed and the Sunnah was given, that word Rabb started taking on a significance in which it was primarily used for Allah the Exalted. Mm-hmm. So then you started saying, okay, well, listen, we're talking about people. We should be focusing on using the word Sayyid, which conveys much the same meaning of mastership, which is the second meaning of the word Rabb. Then he goes on to say, and no one of you should say abdi, amati. No one of you should say my abd, my amma, but let him say my fata and my ghulam. Let him say my female and my ghulam. Now, the significant part of those is abd has always meant worshipper, slave, or devotee. So Abu Lahab, one of the uncles of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, his name was Abdul Uzza, which means the worshipper of devotee of Uzza. And it's that word abd assumes permanence, because no one would assume that he's only going to be a temporary servant of Uzza. No, it's permanent. that he is the eternally devoted or the permanently devoted or the constantly devoted worshiper and devotee of Lat or Uzza.
In the same way we have Muslims' names like Abdul Rahman.
Yeah, Abdullah, Abdul Rahman. So he's saying, no one of you should say my abd, but instead he should say my ghulam. And ghulam is normally someone who is 9 years old and 10 years old, and you grow out of the stage of ghulam. You grow out of it. So it's a temporary standpoint. And then he says, no one of you should say my amma, right? Because this is the equivalent, it's the feminine form of abd. But he should say my fata, right? Which again, this is a female that's at 9-10 years of age, and you grow out of that. So the ghulam grows up and he becomes the baligh. The fatah or the fatah grows up and becomes the baligha, right? So these terms are temporary. So that's built into the language. And you see the wisdom and why the Prophet ﷺ specifically went out of his way to change that thinking that this was not to be a permanent state.
Okay, so and then how would this, still on point one, how would this contrast then with New World slavery? I mean, when it's the word slave is used or slavery is used in the English language.
Sure.
Say in the United States law or whatever.
Okay. When we look at New World slavery, because we have to understand the basis of this. So when we're talking about the New World, we specifically mean the American continent, and our particular emphasis is on the United States. Their understanding of slavery was of a permanent institution, that this was permanent, and that people had a right to make the decision to indulge in slavery. In the book Slave Nation, part of the reason behind why the United States was so adamant against interference by the British government was because of the fact that they wanted the right to be able to choose to engage in permanent slavery. And there's a narrative in there regarding a man by the name of a slave whose name was, he had James Somerset after his master, and he escaped when they came to visit London. Escaped into London and sued his master at the time for false imprisonment and being a slave, and demanded his freedom, and successfully sued for it in court, and also changed his name. Something that the master was not able to digest and understand, because he said someone must have put these ideas in his head. So the old world had an understanding, at least in certain circumstances, that a slave could rise above his post. That was not the case in the New World. In the New World, someone, once they were confirmed to be a slave, this was their permanent state. As a side note, it's significant to understand that for 2 millennia, there was a Slavic slave trade through the Teutons and other nations, in which it was so serious that some historians have said that the origin of the word slave goes back to Slav, the word Slav, because it said that they became so well known for being slaves that it became associated with them. Now, the significant point about slavery in the New World, what solidified it, was that this was a permanent underclass of people, a permanent set of people. And in May of 1723, then there came out what were known the Negro, Black, Colored, and Nigger codes. And these codes specifically covered an underclass of people that were to permanently be enslaved. And this was the difference between how we perceive slavery in Islam and how slavery is perceived in the New World as a permanent institution.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. So that book that's Slave Nation by Bloomrosen.
That's correct.
Okay.
Him and his wife put that together. They were both lawyers, and they took a lot of flack at the time that book came out, because the book was perceived as being anti-American, which the book's main premise was that America was built, both the Civil War as well as the Revolutionary War were the reasons for both of those wars is because the United States needed to guarantee permanent slavery for itself.
Okay.
And that's completely outside of the things that are said to children in elementary school and what's said in many universities.
SubhanAllah. Okay. So just next point here. Our understanding, again, the difference between slavery in Islam and New World slavery is who owns the slave in Islam. Who owns the slave, and what can the master do with regards to the slave? Can the master brand the slave?
Okay.
And what rights does a slave have?
All right. So the most important case that one could ever read in the history of New World slavery is the Dred Scott case. The reason why the Dred Scott case is so important is because it establishes once and for all the underlying mechanisms that are involved in New World slavery. So I'll mention this narrated case, and then I'll compare it to Islam. So Dred Scott, he decides to try to sue for his freedom because the case of James Somerset, who had changed his name by letter, the news of what he did in England and other people had spread far and wide. So he decides to try to do the same thing, only this time in the United States.
Okay.
So he sues his master, whose last name is Scott, and he's called Dred Scott. And the judge over the case, presiding over the case, his name is Taney. The case is marked plaintiff in error. And many people say, well, Judge Taney was a racist judge. Obviously, he hated Africans or quote-unquote blacks or what have you. He had no respect for him. And this is what it is. No, plaintiff in error doesn't mean that. Plaintiff in error means that you had the right information, but the right law didn't apply to you because you didn't come to court correctly. Dred Scott came into court with his master's last name. Your name isn't Scott. So how are you going to seek freedom from when you're coming under the auspices? Because people would name their horses. Their horse's name would be, let's say, Lucky. And so the horse's name would be Lucky Scott. So you're coming into court named after your master's name, which necessarily obligates you as his property. And you're saying that you deserve to be free. Plaintiff is in error.
People have dogs nowadays, even.
Yeah, their dogs have the last name. When we had when we were doing a lot of dog breeding, we took in one of our dogs, Abdul Jabbar, and it had our last name. You know, our cats had our last name. So this is the state of the situation. Is it established also that the slave is his master's property in perpetuity? So when he went in there in that case, it was judged plaintiff in error simply because of the fact that Dred Scott came in under his master's name and then tries to get freedom from his master using his master's name to get freedom, and he has no name of his own. So the case was thrown out, and they sided with the master because he was no different to the chair or the furniture or the animals, the dogs, or what have you. Understanding then that in perspective, because he was under the Negro, colored, and nigger codes, you then contrast this with Islam. In Islam, you cannot brand slaves, people taken in battle. You don't say this person is to be branded. In American law, you had the reason why the police force was formed was to catch runaway slaves that had run away from their master and catch slaves that tried to gain freedom. In Islam, when someone takes off and tries to gain freedom or kataba, which is manumission, they're certainly free to do that. Other people are free to try to gather whatever is necessary to sue for that and gather together those principles and then free that person. So branding people, the body of that slave still belongs to him insofar as the capacity that he is Allah's property. So he still has some movement. He marries, he prays, he fasts, he does all of these things. Where necessarily, if in the New World, if you had a religion, whatever it was, that was taken away. You didn't have that. You couldn't get married. So this is why you had, in most instances in New World slavery, you could not get married in most instances. And then you also could not be part of the master's church. And this is why a lot of the quote-unquote black churches formed in the United States, because they weren't allowed to worship in the white churches. And there was argumentation over whether the Negro had a soul. And these are things that as Muslims, we didn't have in our legal system as an argument, whether or not slaves have a soul, whether or not someone can brand them with a hot iron with an R for runner, or whether or not they can be branded on their back or have the master's name tattooed. And whether you can take them and pierce their ears as decoration to make them humorous looking and things like that. We didn't have this as legal system. Now that's not to say that people did not that people didn't abuse that and do so, but that people didn't do castration or double castration on slaves. But there's no precedence in the revealed law, and the fact that Muwafaquddin al-Qudama and Majduddin ibn Taymiyyah wrote texts against castration and double castration. The fact that these texts were written against it showed that it was something that was happening, but also showed that the mechanisms of revealed law don't allow it.
Right. So also on that note, so there's nothing in the revealed law that would forbid a slave from being literate, from studying, from reading.
No. And in fact, there's a very interesting point in the Sirah of Ibn Hisham in which the Prophet ﷺ, he had some slaves, these were POWs, and he said, I will free you, but the condition is you must teach 10 of the Muslims, the weaker Muslims that are with us, how to read. That is the condition for you being freed as your ransom.
Wow.
From the battle that we just had. The condition of that is that you teach them to read and then you will be released. So they taught them the rudiments of the Arabic alphabet, taught them how to start to string the words together. Once that was done, they were released.
And also the issue of, so a slave can get married, and a slave has the right to keep his family with him.
That's correct.
And you don't split the family up and send the child somewhere else.
And sell them, do things like that. So no, the woman that will have the child is known as the Walid. So you can't say, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to now that we've decided to do this, we're now going to take the mother and put the mother with the son to produce a new stock or a hardy stock. No, because that's poisoning the nesib and poisoning the nestle as well. You can't do that. And to say, okay, well, we're going to take the brother and sister and put them with each other. And this will produce... No, because that's incest and that's not allowed in the revealed law. We're not dealing with livestock and that's it. You can't do this. These are human beings. And whether they're interfertile or not, incest is impermissible in the revealed law. So you cannot do this.
Okay.
And even as a side note as well, in New World slavery, slaves don't inherit amongst each other or from the master. In the revealed law, I mean, there's a big graph behind us. One of the 3 points of inheritance is either through marriage, near relatives, or wala, which is a freed slave who's become part of the family of the master to the degree that the slaves either married into them or what have you. And now they are part of the inheritance. They inherit along with other people. And so the hadith in al-Bukhari, al-wala'u liman a'taq, the wala', the connection is for the one who's been freed. Right. So that connection belongs to those people, whereas in New World slavery, you cannot inherit.
Oh, okay. So now in point 3, we just want to back this up a bit and look at how does someone become a slave compared to slavery in Islam and New World slavery? How does someone actually enter into that state? And we want to look at things like race-based slavery, prisoner of war, and so forth.
Okay. Someone, so we'll compare the New World and then we'll compare that to Islam. Someone in the New World would become a slave by virtue of the May 1723 legal codes of Negro, Black, and colored laws. They would become a slave by being born into it because they fall under the rubric of these laws by being referred to as being black. So these are people that had been taken from the African continent, shifted to the United States, and then they have been kept under these laws. They attempted, the very first people to be called nigger, to have black nigger legal codes on them, were the Irish. They attempted to do this in the United States. But because the Irish had somewhere they could go back to, they could escape, go back to Ireland, it became fruitless. Native Americans could escape back into wherever they were from, whether it was the plains, mountainous areas, prairies, wherever they'd come from, homesteads, they could always do so. So when they decided to take people from the African continent and subject them to these laws in May 1723 onwards, then they created this class of people where they could not get back. They could not escape. They had no means of going back. And so by virtue of race, you became a slave in the New World. So these two models of black versus white, initially these law codes had to do with the color of law and people who legally were there, but that racial element was added in May 1723, in which white necessarily meant someone who was pale skinned, when before that wasn't necessarily the case. And then black meant someone dark skinned that had been taken from the African continent.
And that's why we have the book next to us, The Invention of the White Race.
Yes, by Theodore W. Allen, because he goes into detail to show that, as I said, history's first niggers in the English language were the Irish. And it started with an attempt to disenfranchise the Irish in their own country. And that failed, because it started from 1270 onwards. That failed. Then they said, okay, well, what we'll do is, if they decide to come over as menial workers to the New World, we'll do it there. And it failed there. And one of the most famous cases was of a master whipping one of the Irish workers that had been enslaved. And then the Irishman grabbed the whip and winds up whipping him. And going back to where he came from, going back to Ireland where he came from, because there was somewhere to get back to. But the people taken from the African continent did not have that, because the distance between them, access to getting the ships, the language barrier, because the Irishmen and the Englishmen are going to both be speaking English. They both come on the similar ships. The Irishman's come with a writ of security in his hand and a promise of employment. That's not how the African arrived from the continent. He arrived on the continent shackled. He arrived from the continent unable to speak the local language, and whenever possible they try to make it so that he couldn't learn English and other languages. He was forbidden from reading to try to prevent situations where he might be able to then go and leave. Now, in Islam, someone becomes a slave through combat or war. And so a lot of people tend to forget, because they ask questions like, well, how come in battles where you hear about men or women being taken? Because war historically was not just the providence of groups of men that fought. Wars, and it's now starting to get back to how it had been before, but wars previously had been where women would go out with the men to cheer the men on. Sometimes children would march out in certain battalions because their fingers were small enough to where they could launch arrows faster and in greater succession. And you're starting to find that people are choosing now younger soldiers where they hadn't before. So this idea that, why are there women out there? And how do they get the women? Well, because the women are taking part in combat. So people became POWs because they were involved in warfare and combat. And the result of that were these people were carried back to society, because it is, not only was it your business to clean up the battlefield after you finished, and it's a narration that we can see in Ibn Hisham where the Prophet ﷺ and his companions are picking up arrows and shields after the Battle of Uhud, because that all has to go somewhere.
Yeah.
So just like if you have a war, you have to pick up landmines, you have to pick up the bomb, all that's got to be cleaned up. And the same thing with the people.
Yeah.
So where do these people go? What if their own people don't want them back? What if these people have been taken as prisoners in battle?
And their armies fled.
Yeah, the armies fled. Now these people, the ransom has to be paid to do what? To transport these people back to wherever they came from. Yeah. It's not going to be free to transport them across land masses, everything else. Or if you have some of the other armies people, there has to be a swap or a ransom or some type of trade. The same thing that still happens today. Prisoners from Guantanamo were traded for some Americans, and some other troops that were in another country, they were traded. Yeah. This is something that still happens today. It's not something unknown. It still occurs.
So, to move on from that then, so when the Quran is revealed, and then we have in the revealed law all these laws about, say, the treatment of slaves and how slaves are released. The question is, why does slavery exist in Islam? Just fundamentally, why is it there to begin with?
Okay. Slavery is a result of...
You mentioned war, obviously.
Yeah, slavery is a result of war, also known as al-jihad. It's al-jihad or harb or muqatila. It's a result of these. Now, something important that needs to be kept in mind, and we'll probably be coming to it soon, there are some 9 places in the Quran where freeing a slave is mentioned as a command form, and it's considered something laudable. Some 9 places in the Quran. One place where it mentions, twice where it mentions manumission. Okay. Now, That's not in the U.S. Constitution. That's not in the legal books in England. That's not in the Bible. It's not in the Rig Veda. It's not in the Upanishads. It's only in the Quran that you have references being made to freeing slaves in a large number of times. Now, that being said, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said in the hadith in Abu Dawood as well as Imam Muslim in his Al-Jami al-Sahih, jihad has remained extant since the time Allah has sent me up until you fight the false Messiah. Jihad cannot be nullified by the righteousness of a ruler nor the tyranny of one. So this means that jihad and the things that are around it remain extant. Ibn Kathir and Ibn al-Jawzi, as well as Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, rahimahumullah, all mentioned the first jihad coming into effect from the time of Nabiyyuna Musa alayhi salam. And so that's continued down to the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and up till our time now. So part of one of the outcomes, one of the occurrences, one of the effects of jihad is the slavery that comes thereafter, where people are supposed to go, where they belong, because people don't just get freed. Because these people are in a battlefield, they're on the theater of war. Where do they go now? And that has to be decided.
Okay, so on that basis, so in the New World, what you've mentioned already, these color codes from May 1723, but is there more regarding the legal basis for slavery in the New World? Is there more of it? Sorry, what I want to say is, how is it based on race, and where does that come from?
Okay, the slavery being based on race in the New World, one of the sources that they used was a particular commentary on the Bible. Now, some have said that it comes from Sanhedrin 6a2, but I've never run across that. And I don't even know if a Sanhedrin 6a2 exists because I've never run across it. That the reference is that the Prophet Nuh alayhi salam in the book of Genesis is supposed to have become drunk from drinking some fluid from the vine. His children all covered him up except for one that saw his nakedness. Ham pointed to his nakedness and jeered against it. Then it said that Nabi Nuh alayhi salam is said to have cursed Ham and by him being cursed, then his lips became full, his hair became very curly, and his skin was darkened. And it says that he and his sons will be the slaves of Sam and Japheth. Uh-huh. So this became part of the origin of this. Now you can find older texts for this going back to the Catholic Church. There's a text on the Catholic Church it's the encyclical. I'll actually give the detail on the encyclical in the notes at the end, so you can insert it. Okay. But the particular encyclical is to do with the Pope discussing, the Pope of the time, Pius, discussing the New World and slavery. And he mentions that these people are deserving of slavery, that they're to remain enslaved. And in addition to that, that everything that's in the New World, the people, the natural resources and everything, is their property. And so this was the beginning. This set the stage of what later comes into the color codes. This is the legal basis of where this is coming from.
So then we get permanent race-based slavery.
Permanent race-based slavery. Now, people will say that the Reformation set the stage for abolitionist movements. Well, yes, but that was after the Reformation a number of years, and it wasn't Martin Luther that called for abolition. It wasn't John Calvin, Knox, Zwingli, none of those people, Wesley, none of them called for that in a sense that was really applicable. There may have been statements in their writings that they did, but none of them called for it in a sense where they actually took on the government and went out of their way to free slaves, because the founding fathers, one of the reasons why the most popular name amongst people who are called blacks in the United States is Washington is because of the sheer volume of slaves that George Washington had. The sheer volume of them. He's not known for freeing slaves. The same thing with Sally Hemings or even Abraham Lincoln, who we'll probably be discussing him a little bit regarding Emancipation Proclamation. He had slaves even after the Emancipation Proclamation. So you have to start asking, okay, what is this all about?
Okay. So the next thing I want to get to is then we established how someone becomes a slave, and then how does someone become free?
Okay. So now we're talking about someone leaving from the status of riqa to the status of hur, status of slavery to the status of freeness. We'll contrast this with the revealed law. We'll start with the revealed law because up until now we've been going with the New World and the revealed law. Now we're going to go from the revealed law, then we'll talk about the New World and circumstances that they faced. In the revealed law, there are three ways in which one would gain freedom. And I'll give an example in each case. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had 21 freed slaves. And the freed slave is referred to in the revealed law as Mawla, because he is being freed by the master, or he's freed by someone else that's come in. So either he owned that slave or he came in and he saw that someone is in a state of slavery. He took responsibility over that slave and then he freed him. One such example of the 21 freed slaves that he had, one such example was a man bearing the name Safina. Now, when he freed Safina, Safina then asked if he could stay on as hired help and assist the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ in battles and other things such as this. So now that he's a freed slave, he now becomes a khadim, a servant, in which he can either work as a volunteer or paid work or what have you. He can take on these type of jobs. Right. So this is an example of what we know in the revealed law as itq. As itq. Another example of itq, which actually involved money, was, well, actually, we'll come to this in the second one. There's two cases of the second one, which is known as emancipation. Sometimes called mukataba, sometimes called kitaba, sometimes called kitaba. All these are the same thing. So the famous one is Bilal ibn Rabah, in which Abu Bakr and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had to gather together some money to free him. Now, at the time that they gathered the money together for his emancipation, he was being tortured for being a Muslim. And he had a rock placed on top of him and he had been whipped numerous times. So Abu Bakr had now gathered together the gold coins necessary to free him. And the men laughed because they said, well, if you're going to take a slave with a beat up back, with a rock on top of him, just give me this amount. And Abu Bakr hands over the amount and said, had you asked for 1,000 dirhams or more, I would have given it. And the men all stood back, shocked from this account in the Sirah of Ibn Hisham, because they thought, why would you go out of your way to put together so much wealth for someone in their mind that was just beat up, that was just a piece of property that had become damaged?
And you couldn't do much work.
Yeah, couldn't do much work. What would be the purpose in having him? He doesn't have any value. The second example is a case of pale skin slavery that a lot of times we don't talk about, because in English, when we tend to think of slavery, we always tend to think of the horrors of transatlantic slave trade. But Salman al-Farisi was a slave. And when he first arrived, there were Israelites that owned him.
So he's Persian, obviously.
Yeah, he's Persian. There's Israelites that owned him. He had green eyes. They owned him. And he wanted to gain his freedom, but he said, you will not gain your freedom unless, and he offered a price. And so they gathered together the first attempt for his manumission. And when the master saw that they had enough for the manumission, before he was presented to conclude the transaction, he upped the price.
Salman al-Farisi?
No, the master of Salman al-Farisi upped the price. And he did this 3 times. To the point to where some of the companions had to sell off some clothing, some property. Some did extra hours at the market to literally gather together the money for Salman al-Farisi to finally become a manumitted slave. When they gathered the money together, again, the master gave the same reply. All I use this man for is gathering dates and general housework. What benefit would he be in selling to you for this large amount? Why do you want him? And the point was because he was one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he said after this, he said of Salman al-Farsi, innahu min Ahl Bayt. He's from the Ahl Bayt, although he's not genetically from the household of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but because of his rank and his virtue, he was declared to be as such. The third and final type of freeing of slavery is known as tadbir. Tadbir is where someone might have been a slave, and the master says, upon my death, you are free. So this person at the death is free. In this case, he's usually left with something. So he has something left over. He also inherits as well. So he has some inheritance. Saying that, in the second issue of manumission, the manumitted slave, in the case of the first one, which is itq, the slave is just freed outright. Because it's usually the case that the outrightly freed slave has a skill, something to maintain himself, where he can go from place to place or what have you. In the second case, it may be that he doesn't have those things, or he needs a nest egg. So he's actually given something. So mukataba is where he is manumitted and then he's also given something. Okay, listen, we're going to free you, but we're also going to give you something so you can move forward. And then in the case of
that something might be like money or a piece of land.
Or a piece of land, or it might be additional skill, or someone where he can learn a skill from. Yeah. And then tadbir is in the case of someone who has been freed after the death of the master. So Salman al-Farsi started out, he didn't have a skill because he was taken as a young man. So when he got his mukataba, he was taught blacksmithing. By one of the companions. He was taught blacksmithing. And that was the beginning of his having a trade, which is interesting because, again, he now has his own business. He's not just becoming an employee. He has his own business.
Right. So what we're getting at here is that based on the Muslims, when a slave is freed, that slave is given the tools and whatever he needs or she needs to become independent and focus and cope with life, just go on with life.
Yeah.
So this leads to my next question, which is, compared to now looking at New World slavery, why do quote unquote blacks still exist, and why do they live in ghettos? Because I recently had to make a fly-by-night trip to the United States, and I noticed this down in the southeast. Just you can go from a very, very wealthy part of a city. I was looking for masjids. And you find a masjid, and it's in what is a ghetto, and it's incredibly run down, and everyone there is quote unquote black. And you think, like, why are they still here? Why are they in these conditions? And that's what we want to get at, and then to compare that afterwards with where are former Muslim slaves now.
Okay, so in the New World, there was no apparatus in place for freeing slaves, because the whole point was that the institution of slavery was to be one of permanence. So when the decision finally comes, you have abolitionist movements. They didn't have a plan. They were just talking about outright freeing slaves, which was not going to solve the problem either, because, okay, where will they go? How will they function? How will they be? The Emancipation Proclamation was going to be an attempt to free slaves, but to also give them something to enfranchise them and to better themselves after this freedom was given. And this would later be given in the form of a plot of land and also a nest egg amount that they could set a business up or learn a trade or do what have you. But this whole set of circumstances, it was never intended to come to pass. So the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th Amendments are coming about because of all this going on. And even then, they're outlawing the importation of slaves internationally because of the huge economic drain that it's causing. It's not necessarily because of any morality. Then you have, even within the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th Amendment, When you look at the amendment that's to do with prisoners, they make it very clear that no slavery is to take place aboard the shores of the United States other than the criminal duly convicted in court. And they're like, well, wait a minute. They're referring to criminals as slaves.
Right.
And it's like, well, when you're looking in prison systems, people that are called blacks are between 12 and 14% of the population, yet they're the vast majority of prisoners.
Yeah.
And so you're thinking to yourself, okay, how much of this is connected to the past? Mm-hmm. And it is. And you'll look at these places. There was someone that was doing a tour. He's a comedian. I think his name is Godfrey. He's a famous comedian. And he said, I'm going to take you to the oldest black cities in the United States. And he went to one that was in Florida, one that was in Alabama. And he said, look, these people were former slaves. They became freed. And this is the oldest city. Now, he doesn't mention them moving to anywhere else or going anywhere else. They stayed there. Because where else could they go? Because what was supposed to be realized in the Emancipation Proclamation was never given.
Yeah.
So they had nowhere else to go. There was the massive plantations, large areas. Where could they go? There was nowhere for them to go. And because there was nowhere for them to go, they stayed where they were. And sometimes the slaves that were more skilled, that could read, that were more wily, took advantage of those that were less skilled.
Yeah, or illiterate.
And again, what this brings up another case. There was a woman named Ashley Little, and she has a YouTube channel, and she was discussing with her mother the family history, and her mother was always very coy about going into real details about the family, until one day she asked her mother abruptly, were you a slave?
And how old is she now?
She's in her 20s, Ashley Little. So her mother is, coming from, 1940s, 30s, around that time.
Yeah, so well into the 20th century.
Yeah, well into the 20th century. And the mother says, okay, the discussion we're about to have, you have to be prepared for. And then she starts to unveil this discussion about how she was picking cotton when she was young, how she was beaten, how she was raped, and that the reason why Ashley Little is very fair complected and has freckles is because she was raped. And this is in the 20th century. It's because of the fact that there's no itq of freeing slaves that's clearly mandated in law. There's no mukataba, there's no emancipation mentioned, there's no tedbir, post-death slave. There's no actual precedent set, because when these declarations were made, there was no structure put in place. So every so often, there's an incident like this that crops up, or some high profile case. I think you remember we were discussing once about the girl, I think it was either Gonzaga or some major Catholic institution, in which the woman sued them because when they were going broke because they ran out of money, they mortgaged their slaves as a means of floating and keeping the university intact. And one of the females, quote unquote blacks that was alive at the time, said, well, I am the descendant of one of those floated slaves. And what you did was wrong. It wasn't right. So what they offered her as a sort of piecemeal offering is, okay, what you'll do is you'll go to university for free all 4 years. We won't charge you anything. And that should assuage your anger and everything else. And this is how they've been dealing with it. And there's case after case after case like this that keeps cropping up. And this is going to be the case over and over again because...
We mean reparations.
Well, not reparations, because reparations is to repair damage that's been done. But it's not a reparation. It's a labor dispute. Because it's something that was agreed between the United States government and the people called blacks that, listen,
when was this?
We do need, this was around the 1860s. We do owe you this.
With the Emancipation Proclamation?
Yeah. This
people
is coming
supposed
out.
to be paid.
Yeah, you're supposed to be paid. We owe you this amount.
Is that the acres and
the 40 acres and a mule? We owe you this. We realize that we do.
But not everyone was paid this.
But not everyone was paid. This wasn't doled out. So because of this, and they're the only group that the United States government has actually said, listen, we realize we owe this. The Chinese, for what happened during the railroad incidents when they died in big numbers, they were paid. The Japanese internment camps, they were paid. Right. Now, every other false group since that time has been piggybacking off of the black civil rights struggle to say that we're owed something and we're oppressed, when in reality, they're stepping on the heads of those people. Now, that being said, to properly sort out what we're calling the race issue in the United States, you'd have to do the equivalent of a hard reset on your phone. You'd literally have to break down the whole legal system and bring it in, because the actual flaw is in the entire structure. Now, the amendments have done the equivalent of taking pressure off the cooker, but it hasn't relieved everything, because these large yawning gaps are still there. Yeah. And this is a result of not properly dealing with the topic of slavery, making it all permanent, not resolving the matter, and not creating a situation that encourages other people to assist other people. Because to free a slave, as well as to emancipate a slave or do tadbir of a slave, requires something inside of you. You can't legislate morality. Part of it has to come from inside of you. You have to I want to help these people.
And then there has to be something, there has to be a mechanism that actually incorporates those former slaves into the society.
Yes. And so when you go to a place like Egypt or Algeria, you'll see people that have red hair, green eyes, and they're Mamlukes. And everyone knows that they're Mamlukes, and they know that they're Mamlukes. But they're considered just as Algerian as anyone else. They can get passports. They can vote. Yeah. We got medical insurance. Yeah. We can't say that for people who are quote unquote black in the United States. They don't have,
because those term black, that term still exists.
Yeah,
black,
that term's
white.
Still there.
I mean, it's one of the things I notice, especially from, say, quote unquote blacks on the conservative side of things. Say someone like Walter E. Williams or Ben Carson. They'll raise the point. They say, "Why am I always referred to as an African American? Huh. Like when am I going to become an American?
Yeah,
I've been here just as long as you guys have, probably longer. Yeah. But I'm still an African American. You guys aren't European Americans.
Yeah, they're just Americans.
So it's like, how come I'm never ever going to be just an American?
Yeah, and that's the same. That's a similar argument an athlete Floyd Mayweather Jr. had. Is he said, "I'm sick and tired of being called by these titles." He said, "I'm an American. I went and represented the United States in the Olympics.
Yeah.
Why is this separation being made between me and everyone else? I represented everyone else. Yeah. I shouldn't be called anything else. I'm an American."
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I think it was Muhammad Ali, after he represented the United States and won the Olympics, and he came back and he wasn't served at a restaurant. Yeah. And he just tossed his medal in a ditch. You thought, what the hell is this? It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, it's purposeless. Because, again, the failure to deal with the topic of slavery and integrating people into society. The point of slavery is not to permanently keep an underclass of people. The point of slavery is the people that have come about because of a war or whatever else, that they need to be either integrated back into their own societies or integrated into our societies so they can continue with their lives.
Yeah. So this whole, I think you've used the analogy many times before, this box of crayons that they have in the United States. You're black, you're white, and then you're
yellow.
You're yellow, and then you've got the Hispanic people, Latin people. So what's actually going on? Who is an American then? Yeah. Everyone's broken down these categories. No matter what they do, you're always going to be black, and we always have to talk about. We have to talk about the black vote. We have to talk about the Latino vote. We have to talk about.
Yeah, because people start being looked at as block votes, and when people start to be looked at as block votes, as these constituencies, then they also start lobbying these constituencies as well. They're like, okay, well, we've sent our lobbyists, and from what we can gather, the blacks are on board with Medicare, but the Hispanics, they hate it.
Yeah, and there's also this assumption. I think it's one of the things that Thomas Sowell pointed out. He said there's this assumption again. Him and more recent Jordan Peterson made this point that this whole talk about what they talk about now, but diversity. If we're going to have a college class or we're going to have a board of directors at a company, there should be a white person, well maybe, but it should be like a black person, a Latin person, a Latino person, a woman, a Mexican, whatever it is. And both of these authors point out, they say, well, you're assuming therefore that every black man thinks the same way. Every white man thinks the same way. Every woman thinks the same way. Every Mexican thinks the same way. That's not diversity.
Yeah, and you're even assuming as well that they want to be there. Yeah. Sometimes someone will look at a company and say, "Well, there's no one working in this company in Port Orford, Oregon, that's Mexican. Why is that?" Well, maybe because no Mexicans live in Port Orford.
Yeah,
that's probably why.
Maybe no Mexicans want to live in Port Orford.
Yeah, and that's precisely the issue.
Yeah,
you're more likely to find maybe a Klamath Falls tribal member living near Port Orford, Oregon, than you are to find Mexicans. So the reason why you don't have any Mexicans, because Mexicans haven't applied for that job, because they either don't want to live there or they just don't live there. It's got nothing to do with that there's some deeper agenda that there is to keep Mexicans from working there. It's nothing to do with that at all.
Okay, so we've covered this point as well. So where do former Muslims slave now? So what we said, so people like the Mamluks and the Seljuks and so forth, they just incorporate into the society.
Yeah, they're part of the society.
They're not seen as, we don't call them something else Muslim or
Yeah, we wouldn't sell you these, Muslim Seljuki, Muslim Mamluki. We don't do that. These people, like for example,
and they don't live in their own separate ghettos.
No, they live there. So in the north of Egypt, there's Greeks, Armenians, Russians, Turks, right? All those people are there, but they all live in Egypt. They all have the passport. They all have the same, ideas. They're generally moving along that same pattern. Now, they do have their own culture. That much is true. But they all have the passport. They all have equal access. They don't have equal opportunity because that's more to do with people's ability and strengths. Yeah. But they have equal access. And that's the point.
Okay. So now the next big thing that comes up here, and this is something that also came up recently in the news because of, it was shown that thanks to American intervention in Libya, we now have slave markets. So now the question is there, and has there been, over the past several years or centuries, something called an Arab slave trade?
This issue comes up because it's connected to the idea of the transatlantic slave trade. And you can't compare one without talking about the other. The transatlantic slave trade is conditioned upon the principle of specifically going into the African continent for no other purpose except for the fact of the skin color of the people there that deserve to be in slavery in perpetuity, and using them as a permanent underclass to build up the new world. That's the raison d'etre for the transatlantic slave trade. Now, that same thinking is thought that, okay, this is the same thinking that undergirds what they would say. This is what the Arabs did when they came to the African continent. They did the same thing. Well,
or they also add that it was Arabs who were selling, European African slaves to the Europeans.
Yeah.
And so forth.
First of all, we have to understand that yes, there were wars that were happening in Africa, and there were things that were going on, but there was no codified set of ideas in which the Arabs said the people of the African continent are such that we're going to ship them off or use them for slaves to build up our societies and countries.
Or their reason for existence is the fact that they're black, therefore they should be.
And that's it. Yeah. We have no text for that. We have no history of massive shipments of tribes of Tanzanians or tribes of Bantus being sent back to Arabia to build up buildings. We don't have this. It's not there. Now, were there wars and situations where there were members of African tribes or African tribes that were enslaved in the course of wars? Yes, that's true. But there was no collective idea to depopulate or to mine Africa for human souls or African bodies for the sole purpose of building this super civilization.
I think you could just to add to that point, so if you go to the quote-unquote Arab world today, and we talked about that in the previous podcast, who are the Arabs, you're not going to find, again, quote-unquote black ghettos, in Cairo or Damascus or Mecca. Or
they're not there. And you also have to understand, the Arabs coming into Africa, the skin color was already similar.
Yeah.
So what exactly would the Arabs, what would they be using as a base when the skin color was similar? We have markings on the pyramid walls of Arabs next to Egyptians who are maybe a shade or so lighter, but they're generally the same eye color, same color. The hair texture is similar or exact. You have to remember that the people that are coming there, the language and religion is really, for the most part, what they're sharing is different. Now, the skin may have been darker, the hair texture may have been slightly different, but these are people that are both coming from what's known as the subduction zone. They're dark-skinned people living near the equator. So we're not talking about something completely alien like people coming from near the poles down to the equator. The differences are not that extreme. So this idea that there's some sort of setup. Now, then they go on to say that the Arabs were the ones that were committing these double castrations and carrying all these things so they couldn't reproduce. This is why they did this. No, that's not why they did this. There's nothing, as we've already quoted examples from Muwafaqud Qudam Majduddin Taymiyyah against double castration or castration at all.
What is a double castration exactly?
Double castration. So castration is to remove the testicles. The same way, so one would wrap either a rubber band or a rope or some type of string around the testicles to cut off circulation. Then they fall off. Okay. And this is to keep reproduction from happening. So you can sustain an erection, but you cannot produce children. And this was often used for, in Europe, this was done to keep singers having a falsetto, so that way they never lose their falsetto, their voice never cracks because they don't go through puberty.
Okay.
Double castration was to remove both the penis as well as the testicles. And so the remainder of what's there is literally a slit like what you see for the vagina.
Okay.
Genitals are gone.
Yeah.
Male genitalia are gone. So they said, well, this is done because this is part of... No, it's nothing to do with the hatred of the African continent or the hatred of people living in Africa. That was being done to the Janissaries way before that.
And they're Greek, right?
And yeah, they're Greek. Some of them are Cypriots. Some of them are Cossacks. They're all different types of stuff. It was being done because it thought that it made them tougher because they weren't tempted by sexual antics. It was done to them as well because some of them were guarding women in the palace and guarding concubines in the palace. Something that's also not allowed because you need to be married in the revealed law to have sexual intercourse. But nonetheless, these men were being used to guard these quarters because there's no way they're going to fornicate with these women because they don't have genitalia. It's impossible.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what these people would be used for. It's said to make them tougher. Just like some of the ancient Egyptians circumcised the men that marched into battle because they thought that a man who'd been circumcised, it would make him meaner, which probably, if you are old enough to remember your circumcision, it probably would make you mean. And you'll go into battle and you'll be tougher.
Yeah.
Right. The same way the ancient Egyptians circumcised their women because they thought it made them purer and it also made them more resilient. Right. So this idea of removing the labia minora and the labia majora, something that was still there when the Arabs arrived in Egypt and arrived in Africa. Yeah. Right. That people were practicing this form of female circumcision in which the labia minora, labia majora was removed and sewed shut. Something that the Arabs tried to stamp out, something that's not mentioned.
Yeah. People associate, female circumcision or what they call genital mutilation. They associate that with Islam, and that's something that we...
That's it. Not realizing that
teach,
Imam Khushu'i and others mentioned this. We discovered this when we came to Egypt and found this happening.
Yeah, because I did put a fatwa on my blog by Mama Bolti. It's slightly off topic, but I did put a fatwa on my blog by Mama Bolti about female circumcision, but I also included a map of where that's prevalent in today's world. And it's on the African continent.
Yeah.
But it's not just, those aren't Muslim countries.
Yeah.
It's in, majority Christian countries.
That's right. Uganda. Uganda's like majority Catholic.
Yeah.
Whereas what are they doing it for?
And then you barely find it. It's very, very predominant in Egypt, which is a huge Muslim majority country. But at the same time, you don't find it in Syria. You don't find it in Jordan, Iraq. You don't find it on the Arabian Peninsula. Yeah.
And then the Arabian Peninsula, there are Arabs. Syrians are Aramaeans and Phoenicians. Libya, these are Lebanon, these are Phoenicians. Iraq, these are Aramaeans and Phoenicians. It's not there. Okay. Then you find it in Egypt among both Christians and Muslims. Okay, so you're like, okay, well, what's the basis for this? Well, some of these people, and then you have different levels of circumcision in Egypt. So you have the people a lot of the Christians are doing the Pharaoni circumcision, which is just the labia minora, labia majora. So you're actually doing a clitoridectomy and you're removing the two outward layers and sewing it shut, right? So you have that, and then you just have the circumcision where you're removing the clitoral hood. Yeah. So there's different levels of circumcision in Egypt.
The clitoral hood, that's the one that's mandated in the revealed
law. That's allowed because the removing of the clitoral hood is the same thing as removing the foreskin from the penis. Same thing.
Yeah.
Right, and we're almost going into another podcast, but the point in case is there was no Arab mind in which a group of Arabs came together and said, to build up our civilization, to build up our empire, to build up our power base, the way to do this would be to go to the African continent, to these people who have been mandated by divine writ to be slaves in perpetuity, and we will use them for this task.
We'll snatch them and enslave them in perpetuity.
Yeah, and that's it. There's no such set of circumstances for that in the revealed law.
So just on this topic of the Arab slave trade as well, there's recent news. Remember, we were actually discussing this last year. So what about these slave markets in Libya nowadays? I mean, what have you looked into?
The slave markets in Libya, a lot of these things are coming about. These people are being sold. And if you look at the people selling them, many times the people selling them are darker than the people that are being sold.
Okay.
And the people that are selling them are Arabs. Now, a lot of the people that are selling them are because these people have paid money to try to be smuggled out of the country.
And into Europe. It's all part of that,
That's it. Then they've taken that and said, no, that's not enough. Or we're taking this because you've given us this amount of money and it wasn't enough. Because, as we know, the money currencies are fluctuating.
Yeah.
So they arrive and the currency's lost some of its boom.
Especially because Libya now is in such turmoil.
Yeah, it's in free fall.
So
they arrive and they're not there. So then the smugglers, they've got people they have to make their money back to.
Yeah.
So they said, okay, listen, I don't have the full amount. So what I'll do is I'll give you what he gave me, and you can have him as well. You can have his children as well. You can have this. It's nothing to do with some type of mass conspiracy that all we're doing. Even if we go back to the Darfur situation with the Janjaweed militia, the Janjaweed, which are Arab from the Bakara tribe, they're Arabs. They're Bedouin Arabs, and they're darker than the people in Darfur.
Yeah.
So how could this be a light-skinned versus dark-skinned thing? And the Janjaweed are darker than the Darfur residents. They're actually darker.
Yeah, and this is that same problem. What people do is they take the race situation in America and that black-white dichotomy.
And say, that's everywhere. It's all over the world. There's nothing we can do. And that's where that whole idea comes from. There's a worldwide, global white supremacy system, and we're all under it.
Yeah.
And we have to work against it, and we have to do this because it's everywhere. Anti-blackness is everywhere. It's in Japan. It's like, no, they like being pale because the Japanese are already kind of fair.
Yeah.
And that's been there before any contact with Europeans or anything.
Or even further, even on the Indian subcontinent, people make this thing about, why are darker skinned people looked down upon and fair skinned people are praised, and that a lot of it has to do with class. The fact that if you were darker skinned, that was a sign that you were a peasant, you worked in the fields all day, and you were burned by the sun.
That's it, and that's before European exposure.
Yeah.
Now, maybe after European exposure, it probably took on a different slant in a lot of parts of India. But before that time, they had a preference for lighter skin before then.
Yeah.
And it had nothing to do with the hatred of melanin or any of that garbage. It had to do with a class structure.
Yeah. And that even exists in England, because that's one of the things that even comes up. Like I think Jane Austen puts this in.
That's where the origin of the term.
Prejudice. Yeah.
I mean that's where the origin of the term. Sorry to interrupt. The origin of the term redneck comes from.
Yeah.
A lot of the people that worked in the sun, they would have these Irish, and it's also the origin of the word peckerwood. There'd be Irish slaves working in fields in the U.S., and they'd be getting burned from the sun on their neck.
Yeah.
So their neck would be left red.
Yeah.
And that the red, because the type of woodpecker they had in the United States as well had a red neck.
Yeah.
So that man would be called a peckerwood.
Okay.
Now that's been rolled out for all people who were quote unquote white or answer to the term white. But originally, traditionally, it applied to the first niggers in the English language, which were Irish people.
Yeah.
They were called rednecks and sometimes called peckerwoods.
Yeah. Because what I'm remembering is also that in the Jane Austen's book Pride and Prejudice, that there's that theme of Mr. Darcy is the wealthy landowner and he has, or Mr. Bingley, and they both have sisters, and they're very fair skinned, right?
Yeah.
And they do everything they can to avoid getting a tan.
Yeah,
they're all
having parasols or umbrellas,
or something on their skin to cover it, because being dark skinned is associated with lower class people who work in the fields and so on and so forth.
They can't afford to be indoors. They're not enjoying a life of leisure.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not this giant global white conspiracy.
Yeah.
Now, the next question that comes up is, how valid is the claim that the British abolished the international slave trade through the efforts of William Wilberforce? And to add to that, or maybe to undergird that, is slavery something that's supposed to be abolished? I mean, because in the context of obviously that war continues.
Okay. The answer to this question, just like there's two questions, the answer is going to be twofold. The idea that Wilberforce and other similar abolitionists were the cause for slavery being abolished it's false from the following standpoint. One is the argument against the international importation of slaves. That argument was there before abolitionists because it was a tremendous drain.
Yeah.
And it was one of the things that was pushing piracy.
Yeah.
It was also leading to the shifting of borders because you can't have a colonial empire when the borders keep getting shifted because you're importing and exporting people. It's not safe because people are escaping into the wilderness and there's brigands and all these other things. So this was starting to be looked at already by entrepreneurs and businessmen from a pragmatic standpoint before Wilberforce and these other people were even in the mix to discuss this. When the time came where they said, well, we've decided to abolish the international importation of slaves, fine. But that didn't mean that slavery itself was abolished. Slavery itself carried on and carries on today. There are still, as we discussed, people being smuggled into this country. Now, in order for people to be smuggled into England or to the United States, there also have to be not just the smugglers from the country, but there need to be American and English smugglers who are also benefiting from it.
Yeah.
There are containers of Russian women that are arriving, containers that you would normally have with garbage or produce in them that are filled with Chinese people that are making their way here. And these are people that are being used to work in factories and fields here. It's still, before automation takes over, there are still Mexicans being forcibly imported, Panamanians being brought into the United States and other places. So when you look at reports on slavery, the massage parlors...
Or just at that point, just the term is human trafficking.
Yeah,
that's a huge thing.
Which is still happening, and it's a fancy word of saying slavery.
Yeah.
It's the same thing that's still going on. It hasn't been lifted. It's not been gotten rid of. Now, should we try to abolish slavery, or should slavery be abolished? Slavery will not be abolished. The end of this will not be known until the end of jihad is. And the end of jihad will not be known until the end of time, when the Messiah comes and the end of things, the end of this system of things as we know it is brought to a close.
Yeah.
Prior to this time, which is mentioned in the Hadith in the Sahih al-Muslim, prior to this time, there's not going to be any way to abolish it because, again, slavery is an outgrowth that happens because of wars. And wars happen because of oppression. They happen because of wickedness.
There's resources.
There's self-defensive mechanisms, and sometimes there are offensive campaigns that are done to preempt invasions and other things like that. That comes to a stop with the end of the system of things as we know it. But as of right now, as the system as we know it remains, these things must remain and continue.
Yeah, because it's not just us fighting wars. Muslims, it's the fact that all nations on earth are involved in wars, will be involved in wars.
There are some 40 wars going on right now. In a time right now where, to just go off on a tangent, where spokesmen for Islam in the West have said that this is a time where the earth is in relative peace. It's like the time they wrote that, there's 40 wars going on.
Yeah.
What on earth are you talking about? The men have beaten their swords into plowshares. Where are you living? What men have beaten their swords into plowshares? And they're learning the science of war no more. Yeah, maybe in your house, where you guys are eating corn on the cob and you're kicking your feet up and you're enjoying themselves. But the rest of the world is engaged in serious combat. There's war over resources. There's
things might be different in Berkeley for them. I don't know.
Wars are being waged over precious metals. In order to get the lithium and a lot of the fancy phones that we use, someone has to pay the price for that. Someone's got to do that mining. People are dying in mine shafts and all these other things. And you're saying the world's in a state of relative peace. No, where you live is in a state of relative peace. That's not the other 3/4 and 80% of the planet.
Yeah, what you're referring to is the Mardin Declaration, which I think actually one of the things they said in there was they said that because of international treaties and international organizations, all of humanity has achieved safety and security.
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely just stunning thing to say. Yeah. And then from that, you have to ask, what is the point of all the end of time prophecy? Like,
Yeah.
why is
Why is the false Messiah coming?
Yeah.
Why is the Messiah himself coming?
Imam Mahdi coming? What's
Why,
all that about?
why are there these wars that are prophesied to come? These huge wars that are prophesied to come. What is the point in all of this?
Yeah.
What's the point in all of this?
Yeah. Well, alhamdulillah, that website's been removed, but some people still cling to that.
Yeah.
So I think we've also we've kind of covered number 7 here. Is there slavery today in the New World? Okay, so we've established that. Now, what kind of what part we mentioned Libya? Is there any type of other slavery that might exist in the Muslim world now? I mean, or is it just usually going to be?
There's going to be
prisoners
things
of
like
war?
there's going to be things like that, but then there's also going to there'll be prisoners of war. There'll be smuggling. Sometimes the kafil system, people will really abuse that, and then it could become something akin to slavery if people get abused to the point where their passport gets taken off them and they're not allowed to do anything. Some of the maids, the way they're treated when they come from the Philippines and other places, and their wages are taken, or sometimes their wages are withheld, and their passports are taken off of them, and things like this. This is a type of slavery where they're building these buildings, or they're acting as maids or au pairs, and they're just being prevented. Even in France, there was the au pair that was kept in by that Algerian family in a complete form of slavery, and she was gaunt and died.
Yeah.
So this is going on in the Muslim world, it's going on here.
Yeah, because there are situations, because that obviously what happens, in certain Gulf countries, there's that issue of the kafil system, which, alhamdulillah, there are moves now to remove it and abolish it, because it's caused so much problem. And there was even there was in Qatar, there was even like a French football player who was like stuck for like 2 years or something.
Wow.
Because they said he owed some money, and he wouldn't get his passport. He just stuck in that country for a 2-year period. But you do get these stories in the news that come up where people have been, this is all over the world. People have been held in a basement for a long time, only allowed to come out certain times. They're made to work, do forced labor.
Yeah, I mean, you even have Joseph Fritzl, where he kept his children in slavery in his basement, and he sired children with his own daughters.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's another example of this type of slavery.
Yeah, and this stuff goes off. It happens completely out of sight, out of mind. Very little people can do about it.
Yeah, there's not a lot you can do. The best thing you can do is just those 3 methods, which is itq, mukataba, and then tadbir.
Yeah.
Because those 3 principles safeguard and make sure that people that have suffered, that have been under the yoke, whether it's through a fault of their own or through no fault of their own, that they can successfully, to the best degree possible, reintegrate themselves back into the society that they're currently in, or the society that they were previously in, and realize the goal of establishing themselves in a family.
Yeah.
It safeguards that.
I think one thing also to mention here, because it comes up, is also, I mean, there's this whole debate now in the United States about having a wall on the southern border. And it's like, if you take a closer look at it, the people who advocate the wall, they say, a lot of that has to do with human trafficking. And the people who are against it say, no, there shouldn't be a wall, there shouldn't be a border. It's like, no, well, we want to have legal immigration, because illegal immigration, that actually allows for wealthy people living in those southern states to bring over labor, to bring over, to have cheap workers to clean their swimming pools and to attend to their farms or whatever it is. And those people, if you think about that, actually those people are in a state of slavery because they're there illegally. If they try to move out from whatever job it is they're doing,
They're hampered.
They don't have any paperwork. They have nothing. And you take it further, people say that it goes deeper. There could be also forms of sex trafficking going on, children being trafficked.
People get sexually abused as well.
Yeah. So it's not only because there's this movement nowadays coming from the left, like, oh, we need a borderless world, and there shouldn't be none of these checks and none of these things. Like, well, no, take a deeper look at it. Why? Think of why, because like you were saying before about the whole Emancipation Proclamation, it's not always a moral cause that's behind these things. It's usually just practicalities and pragmatic issues.
Yes.
In the same way that people talk about, let's say the women's liberation movement and having women in the workforce, and this is good. And for example, the United Kingdom, I remember my father explained this to me. In the United Kingdom, women in the workforce, that wasn't just a thought that came to the ruling men of this country that thought, women should be working.
It was
No,
a concerted effort.
it was because of World War II, for starters. All the men, the vast majority of the men, were out fighting in the war, so women were drafted into the factories.
Yeah.
And that's what led to this idea of the women being working. And then I think we discussed it in the last podcast also about the powers that be in the government. This is the case in the Senate of the United States, something that the film director Aaron Russo mentioned when he died, that they saw it as, oh, well, look, we can get the other half of the population into the workforce, and that means more taxes.
Yeah.
That means that the children do not have their parents because both parents are working. That means we can get them into the schooling system earlier.
That's it.
Start
latchkey kids.
Yeah, start the brainwashing early.
Yeah, and then from that, then they said, "Oh, well, there's even another section within the household that remain unexploited, the children." So then they start creating teenagers, then tweenies, and just goes from there and there and there and there, and it carries on.
Yeah. So I think it's a final point. Is we're going to discuss further reading and related issues. So the first thing I want to mention here is, when you were doing your 13th Centuries of Islamic History class, this was 7-8 years ago, you did talk about the Atlantic slave trade. And what I did is I took those episodes, or that one, I forget which week it was, I think it was week 7 or week 8, and I took those videos and I put them onto my blog as one blog post.
Right.
And it's called The Atlantic Slave Trade. So I'll link that below so that people can listen to those classes. That's going into detail, the Atlantic slave trade. And I've also put up a book list there. Is it okay if we just talk about these books briefly, just what they cover and so forth? So the first one mentioned here is The Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz del Castillo.
Okay. Part of this is going to be dealing with the conquest of New Spain, deals with the state of play after the 1492 and 1699 collapses of Muslim governance in Andalus, which later becomes Spain and then becomes split into Spain and Portugal. And then them heading out, the conquistadores heading out to the New World and the empire that was established in Hispaniola and other places that they'd set up. And the type of system that they set in place because of the Pope at the time's pronouncement on the New World.
Okay. And then the second book we have here is The Comanches, The History of a People by Fehrenbach.
Okay, that book talks about the settlers in the United States and their experience with what we're calling the Native Americans, or the Aborigines, or the original peoples of the United States. That again,
or First Peoples now they call them.
Yeah, that again has to do with how they were going to encounter these people, how they should treat them, and they didn't have the black codes at that point. They had what were known as the Indian civil laws, which were similar, cutting their hair, sending them off to Christian mission schools, and just completely effacing whoever they are as a people.
And then we have, I think you've already discussed this one, Slave Nation, How Slavery United the Colonies and Sparked the American Revolution.
That's right. That book covers how slavery really, really sort of accelerated what would later become the Revolutionary War that led to the United States.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't the Boston Tea Party and guys dressed up as Native Americans wearing feathers. It was a much deeper issue.
Is that I think, just correct me if I'm wrong here, did you say earlier that this book kind of explains how permanent race-based slavery is kind of the foundation stone?
Yes. That's the touchstone of the United States, and there's no way to escape that.
Okay. Then we have the fourth book is The Crescent Obscured, The United States and the Muslim World from 1776 to 1815 by Robert J. Allison.
Yes. Now that is to do with the first relations that the fledgling U.S. Republic had with the Muslim world. Attitudes they had towards slavery. Attitudes they had towards liberty. That's a brilliant look. That book really doesn't get the exposure it deserves, because of how uncomfortable it makes the readers are. When it first came out, that book, first edition, was bought up very quickly. And it gives a great look at comparisons between old world versus new world thinking.
Okay.
A final work I'd want is, as we discussed, The Invention of the White Race. It's 2 volumes. Okay, it's by Theodore W. Allen. And the book, what makes this book so powerful is it discusses the Irish the Irish being exploited first from the 1200s onward. Then when they realize that it's not going to work, they then move on to the next group, which happens to be the African continent, trying them out because they realized we can't completely exploit the Irish because they still have their language, they still have their country, they still have, they have home court advantage. Then they realized that we need to take a group of people out of their element and to control them in order to properly exploit them and make them build the type of society that we're looking for. And it became a race-based situation from May of 1723 onwards. But the book builds you up. It literally it's like being on a roller coaster from the years, say, 1200 all the way to 1723. I mean, it's the bibliography is around 50 pages. It's a very heavy read. You have to take your time reading it. It's not for bedtime snoozing. It's not easy listening. This is a careful read, a very physical read, a diligent read. Sometimes I had to read a page 3 or 4 or 5 times to properly digest it before I could move on to the next chapter.
And you've written a book reviews for both volumes, right?
That's correct.
And they're on the Georgese blog, so we'll link those. I think there's also the book The Little Matter of Genocide.
Yes.
Holocaust Now in the Americas by Ward Churchill.
By Ward Churchill. Now that covers from
1492 to the present.
That's correct. So that deals with how the settlers, or how the first men to set foot in the New World, how they dealt with the Native Americans, how they dealt with other people, relations between those nations in the New World. And it was an amazing book because, again, the bibliography was like 50 pages. And it had newspaper articles and book reviews. There were just so many different levels of understanding that I had not pursued with this book. And there were things that I had suspected that book confirmed, and things that I had not thought of that book pulled out of me. So these books are a must if you want to understand New World versus Old World thinking, as well as New World versus Old World slavery. Those are a must for anyone who wants to understand these. They're just a must. But it will take you time to read through these. It would be something that I would say you could probably start a book club.
Yeah.
And have like a club of the month where you would read a book a month. But you take your time going through them.
Okay. I think something else that just came into my mind right now, because we've been having this discussion earlier today, how also one of the differences, I think, between slavery in Islam and New World slavery is that when Muslims enslaved people, there was no attempt, mandated or otherwise, to completely wipe out the background where these people come from, to wipe out their history, to wipe out their lineage, to wipe out their religion.
Yeah. To say, okay, that's it now. You're gone. You're no longer you. You're us now.
Yeah, you're not Kunte Kinte. You're now Toby.
Yeah.
Yeah. And because that's what we had this discussion here today about. Again, this is why we were looking at how, quote unquote, blacks in the United States, they're constantly trying to find out where they come from.
Yeah.
So they associate with, ancient Egypt, and they associate with the Niger Delta, or then they associate with West Africa, or whatever. They're constantly,
they're on the move, and it comes from something that was outside of their control. Someone came in and decided, you're no longer this. We've decided that you're going to be this. But then when they attained whatever level of emancipation it was, if we can call it such, there were still these big gaping holes in their history.
Yeah.
And so we see the dangers of destroying people's lineage, destroying who they are, destroying their language, destroying their culture, what that leads to. And we see that on a much deeper level.
Yeah, because that's one of the things, because we were looking at that place, what was it, Tamaray in Georgia?
That place. Now, that was the most successful example of enterprising in the United States, where we had a sect of people who would call themselves blacks gather together and create a civilization. They were calling it Egypt of the West, called Tamaray. They just literally tried to create this civilization.
What does that mean, like Land of the Sun or something?
Tamaray? Yeah, Land of the Sun. They tried to create this new civilization. And it was an attempt to harken back to what they would thought was their glorious past. And ultimately, when that community came to an end, you saw bulldozers coming in and tearing down the pyramids and everything else. So the people were left again in a state of shock to move on to the next identity. So, but currently we're still in the phase where people that would call themselves blacks are in this phase of now we're ancient Egyptians. You know, we're this now.
And that's the Hotep movement.
Yeah, this is the whole what some people are calling Hotep, but they would call themselves the conscious community. They would call themselves the conscious community, or woke, which is there's no such word as woke in English, but
it's a verb.
This word is being
verb. To wake
is
up.
he woke?
I
No,
woke
he's
up.
not woke. He's awake. You know? So these type of expressions are being used, but nonetheless, that's what's being used. So the current incarnation is this, as well as Hebrew Israelites. So now people are saying, okay, listen, we're the original Jews. And you'll notice all of these movements, no, we're the original Egyptians, not those guys. Yeah. No, we're the original Hebrews, not those guys. Yeah. No, we're the original. And it's always trying to get back to this original. We're the original. We're the original. We're the original. Right? Because they're seeking to find themselves.
Yeah, because they were just, because I mean, I don't know, have these people, because I do know, obviously, it was a brother we were speaking earlier today, I know that certain people have done, like the brother we spoke to today, they've done, DNA testing and found that, their DNA matches the DNA that's found today, for example, in Senegal or Gambia, West Africa. Yeah. Just out of curiosity, I don't know if you know this, I mean, do these people who advocate this, the Hotep movement and so forth, do they not consider DNA testing or looking at these matters and thinking?
I'm sure they would, but because Egypt is such a landmark civilization, that desire to be connected up to it.
Yeah.
To say, okay, I'm part of this, because so many people quote Egypt and mention it. Why don't they mention the fact that in Sudan there's more pyramids than all of Egypt? But they don't, because we're back at the sort of Eurocentric thinking. It's like, okay, well, LSA Budge mentioned these people are super civilized, everything else. We must be them because they have dark skin, and because the people of Easter Island also have dark skin. The Yanomamo of the Venezuelan outback, they also have dark skin. Why wouldn't you claim them? The Dogon, why don't you claim them?
Yeah. The Sentinelese.
Yeah, why don't you claim the North Sentinel Island, the Sentinelese people? Why don't you claim them? But it's because Egypt has this glorious face that's pointed on it, which is strange because the ancient Egyptians branded their enemies. They had problems with the Nubians. They referred to the Arabs as the Eastern or the wicked Easterners and all these other things. They weren't exactly egalitarian.
Yeah, we also see so many relics of Egyptian civilization today. Yeah. Like we see obelisks and all these major Western cities and so forth. Yeah. SubhanAllah. Okay, so I think we'll finish there. But before we go, because this will be our final podcast for a while. This episode 50. I just want to ask Al-Hajj Abu Ja'far, where can people find you online?
Okay, on YouTube, it's The Reasons for Faith. So it's THE, Reasons, REASONS, 4, the number 4, Faith, FAITH, online. So there's lessons that are going up. There's probably several hundred hours of recordings on there of lectures that we've done of many different topics,
including the 13 centuries of Islamic history.
That's right. That whole thing is up there. I just want to mention very quickly, if you want to understand sort of my teaching style, when I have an introductory class to a series of classes, the introductory class is where I cite all the evidence and where everything's coming from. Then I carry through with the rest of the classes, only making partial reference to those evidences again because I've established them. I've often found the case that people have said, there's no sources being mentioned here except for once, but it doesn't mention the page number and who's printed by. No, I mentioned that in the introductory lessons. That's my general pattern and habit, so that I don't obstruct the listener with mentioning it again every single time, because there's a lot of material to get through.
But I think it's also your style that you want to encourage people to read things in context. So I noticed, like, especially when you quote your books, you don't always say like exact page number or line number.
No, I'll mention about 3 pages.
Yeah,
or I'll mention 3 or 2 pages so they can see a couple of before and then they come upon that statement. So it's in its proper context. I try to do that because that's sort of the style that I do things in. Also, the Jurjis blog, JURJIS, Jurjis is the blog.
That's where you find the book reviews.
That's where we find the book reviews. The Miroth.org or Miroth.infofiend.org website is the one where we find the rulings of the Muraji' that we try to put up on a semi-regular basis. We came under attack from some cultists, and so we're going through a massive cleaning operation on the site because the site was attacked 3 times in succession to the point to where I had to contact my actual server.
Yeah.
And so, inshallah, it should be back the Tuesday after this broadcast.
Yeah, so that's about 2 days from now, inshallah.
Yeah, that's right.
So the next 48 hours or less. Okay, and then also could I ask you just to update listeners about your current and future books?
Currently, all the books that I'm working on, firstly, I'm trying to get all the books that I previously released into second edition. So, A Word of Advice is in second edition, in which we have the inclusion of the Arabic text.
And we've done a podcast on that.
That's right. So that's there. The second is the Divine Text. Will have the inclusion of the Arabic text within it. The third is the Divine Lightning, which has the inclusion of the Arabic text. The fourth of those books is the Three Creeds, which already has the Arabic text, but I've decided to, instead of having facing pages, to put the Arabic, then the translation under it, paragraph by paragraph. So I've put all that there. And those are all on the way. They'll be very shortly with us. Then there's a new text that's coming, which is known as al-Iqtisad fi al-I'tiqad, which is the well-balanced way in Creed by Imam Abdul Ghani ibn Abdul Wahid al-Maqdisi. That's coming out very soon. I'm looking at the final draft of that right now. It should be arriving for my perusal in maybe 2 days. And
proof copy.
Yeah, and once that's there, and I've taken a look at that copy and I'm happy with it, it'll be released. I'll put a copy of the cover on the blog so people can take a look at that and they can purchase.
Yeah, and there's also, could you mention, is the Sift al-Mu'min wal-Mu'mina?
Okay, Sifatul Mu'mini wal Mu'minati by the Imam Dhunun al-Masri. This is also coming out very soon. It's a rhyming text about states of the heart and good character by the Egyptian, Nubian, and then also Bantu. This will be by this particular imam, and it covers topics. It's in a very short, crisp rhyming pattern, but it's a very good text. And inshallah, we went over this just this last Ramadan, and we hope that the believers will enjoy this text as well.
Okay. And is there anything else you'd like to mention?
That's everything.
Okay. Jazakallahu fikum. And also for this channel, for the forward, for this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And also check out my book, The Big Step, How to Survive Islam in the Anglosphere. I'll put a link below. There's also podcasts on that. And inshallah, I myself will be bringing out a few more books in the coming months, inshallah. And with Allah alone is every success. So we ask Allah to reward Brother Abu Ja'far al-Hanbali for giving us all this information, sharing this information with us today. And I hope the listeners also take this information on board and share it. And we ask Allah to grant us tawfiq in all our efforts. Alhamdulillah bil alameen wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.